I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged-up freeway with lines of cars packed together waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The one I work at couldn't be further from the stereotype. The toll booth I operate is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the woods surrounding it, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack with chip paint and an old sign that reads 25 cents, an amount I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 50s. I guess that's when they decided to stop pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm I can flip up or down. The interior is simple with a single chair and a light on the ceiling. The only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator. If you spend a single night out there, you will understand why there isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m., even though it doesn't seem reasonable on the surface for a local government to pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere and operate a booth that makes no money. Believe me, they pay well. The job of running the lonely booth in my town is worth far more than any financial compensation could ever replace the value of what we preserve by keeping this booth operational. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends, and most of the time, the people who live there embrace the myths. Booth is one that is highly respected and rarely discussed. In fact, it's almost an unwritten rule that you keep any discussions about the booth, the road, or anything related private. Everyone in the area knows that something is strange about this place. Practically everyone has seen something they can't explain or something they wish they hadn't. I suspect it's because, aside from a few crazy people, everyone knows it's a myth. Our town, on the other hand, is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade, our public schools are well funded, and nobody is ever stuck looking for work. The reason this is noteworthy is that our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. The money comes from somewhere other than our meager property taxes. The best we can do here is to keep quiet about the things we've witnessed. The only thing we can do is to hope that nobody strays from the road. Every week, we have a private meeting at our town hall that is attended by all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Usually, the meetings don't last more than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting, I think you'll understand why I suspect the federal government or someone else is dumping money into our town and monitoring our small toll booth situation. I know this sounds absurd right now, but once you have a better understanding of my job and recent events, you'll understand. I think this is a good moment to explain what goes on at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. I called a few weeks ago. We've been holding them every day, but they've been taking a lot longer. You'll see why soon enough. The first rule is that the booth does not need to be manned during the day, and nothing happens there after the sun rises. However, the night attendant, who is typically me, is required to arrive at the booth an hour before sunset and remain there for an hour after sunrise. The night attendant is also prohibited from leaving the booth for any reason during their shift. The sheriff or one of the deputies always provides us with a ride to the booth at night and a ride back to town in the morning, so transportation is never a problem. No cell phone, radio, or other electrically powered device is permitted while operating the booth at night. The only electrically powered item that a booth attendant is permitted to carry is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device and accidentally turn it off, store it inside the booth and hope it doesn't turn itself back on. If it does, you'll have to destroy it. This may seem like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. I lasted for about an hour before I couldn't handle the screams coming from my phone and stomped it into oblivion. I've never been informed what the noises are, but I am aware that previous attendants have heard the same thing. Rule 3 is uncommon because cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. and confusion is a common trait among those who find themselves on this road at night. It is the attendant's responsibility to determine whether the driver will be allowed to pass or turned away, causing confusion. When they express additional feelings, such as anguish, anger, paranoia, or terror, try your best to calm them down and relieve their worries. When you think they're ready, you can ask them to pay their toll. If there are no noteworthy reaction questions from the driver, one of two things will happen. We have occasionally had to deal with a few lost travelers, but most of the time they are cooperative. Get them off the road as soon as possible and direct them towards town where they can get their footing above all else. If they threaten you or try to drive through, you must leave the barrier armed down and turn them away. If they do this, you can tell them that you will be calling the police, even though you have no way of doing so. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All the locals know not to use it, so it would be uncommon for an outsider to learn about it. Another possibility, and regrettably the most frequent, is that they will suddenly realize, as shown by their facial expression. It's as though they remember something, slowly reaching into their pocket and taking out a black coin, knowing that they must give it to you in order to pass. Some people accept their fate politely, while others cry, but everyone follows the road, and once the barrier arm is raised around the corner, they drive away, never to be seen again. When I first started working here, I had no idea who these people were or how they obtained these coins. All I knew was that I should leave them in the booth for the next shift to pick up. That is, until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I got home and they mentioned a man who was killed in a car accident the night before and showed a picture of his face, a face I had seen only hours before. Puzzled and afraid as he asked me where he was and what was going on, when I asked him for his toll, he first slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand and pulled out a black coin. Before placing it in mine, he gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning recounting the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead. Just passing through as were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to where beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that in the moment all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades back, a visitor from out of town was passing through town. Back then he didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know of the road because it was never put on any map. My best guess is that he happened to see it and figured it could be some sort of a shortcut when he approached the gate. He was of course turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant pushing him over and raising the arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then they only knew the rules, not the consequences, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth when asked for his toll. This time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through, but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night he pulls up confused as to why he's here and needs to pass, and forgetting each time. Each night he gives us a coin each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, not seen until the next night. He never ages and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times he expresses a sense that he's been here before and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers. Sometimes his fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies, dead, but not being allowed to move on, and never remembering why you're there, living the same moment night after night until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule 4: at some random time during the night, You might hear something moving through the trees. Sometimes they will be coming down the road, and other times they will be coming from the woods. Try not to be afraid, there is nothing dangerous coming your way. In any case, I remember the first time I saw them, I heard a clop somewhere down the road, approaching the booth like a horse galloping. I got up and grabbed my flashlight, intrigued, and I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been told what to do in that situation, and when I did point my flashlight at the road, I almost had a heart attack. Of course, I was warned of this, but the specifics were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate and I was supposed to let it pass, but I was not informed that it was about 9 or 10 feet tall at the shoulder, and that its fur was so dark that I couldn't see it without my flashlight. The only other part of its body that was visible from a distance were its eyes, which glowed with a tiny speck of white light glowing in the darkness. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm, which calmed me down. I slowly raised it and watched as it approached to pass, but as it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, but when I realized that this person or whatever was on top of the moose was staring at me, I yelled but kept my volume down. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose, and it rode on something like a shadow. Like everyone else in their cars, they drove down the road past the bend, and I had to sit down for 30 minutes before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't happy that those finer details had been left out until after my shift, and I expressed my frustration by learning that it turns out that this hunter and his moose have been around for so long that no attendant alive today can recall a time without them. Some people even think they have been here for a couple hundred years, or even longer, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have existed, but we do know that they aren't confined to the road like the others at our town hall. We have a written record of the hunter and his mount riding through the town in the middle of the night back in 1919, and some residents have reported seeing the moose while driving at night. You might be wondering why I call the figure on the moose's back the hunter. And that's what U.S. attendants call him. Occasionally, he and his moose will arrive at the booth with a corpse behind them, and when I say corpse, I don't mean an animal or even a human, for that matter. When the end of the world comes, the hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be sure of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Perhaps it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve, or perhaps the road is a pathway to many different places. These are your worst nightmares, things that make you feel sick to your stomach and shiver down your spine at the same time, things you would expect to find discussed in a religious text. I couldn't tell you what I think, but I think that the other attendants and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose are here to protect us. This is where we get to the point where I'm telling you about all of this. Whatever these things are that he's bringing with him, they shouldn't be here in the first place. I explained before that the people from my town like to keep these things quiet, and for the most part won't agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need, unfortunately. I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him all was quiet for a few hours until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it before I moved to raise the barrier arm. I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind, and the dreadful thing attached. The end of the rope was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man. Long, blackened hands with claws for fingers protruded from a man wearing a red and blue clown suit with ripped sleeves at the wrist. The head was by far the most hideous feature. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer, and blood dripped from its half-opened mouth. The ears were similar to a man's, but they were shaped like a deer. It was as if someone had taken human ears and stretched them out, changing their color and texture to fit the repulsive shape they wanted. On top sat a red and blue jester hat, and a set of antlers protruded. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it, and the moose resumed its trot forward along the road, passing the gate as they passed me. The deer clown creature was dragging a trail of blood down the road behind it, and I couldn't help but watch it. Just before it totally went by the booth, I used my flashlight to catch a last look at its face. Its eyelids flew open, exposing the black and brown eyes underneath, and then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, painful bleat before bending down and clawing at the knot holding its hooves. In a matter of seconds, the ropes were severed, and the beast made an unsuccessful attempt to stand. However, because the bull moose in front of it kicked it in the head, another splash of blood and one of its teeth came from the clown's mouth, and it fell back to the ground, appearing momentarily unconscious. As it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on, and I fled from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road, keeping an eye on the fight. The air shot from the moose's nostrils, and as it started to grunt, the clown's grunts were deeper and louder than the deer clown's bleats, and I felt my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. Finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleat out as if to challenge them at its standing height. This thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged before it connected. The clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away with the hunter holding the new rope. They began to drag the clown by the neck, I assume hoping to finally make it around the bend this time. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods. The hunter on his moose followed. In only a moment they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it meant. The agreed upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days and all would be sorted. I dearly wish that was what happened. A few days later, a video from the town showed two deer antlers protruding above the tops of trees while the man recording was driving. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and a portion of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but the commenters did. Last week, someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees far off in the distance. These are just the ones I've seen, so you can see why we've been holding weekly meetings. I can tell that we're not the only ones in a panic. Strangers began to appear around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They did their best to blend in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaway is when they arrive to our bars and diners, start a discussion, and then inquire about the booth and the odd things they've noticed recently. We kept the tooth in the town hall along with every other document and record we have about the booth, but it's all gone now. It's obvious that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to, and that we weren't the only ones who noticed I didn't work last night. The attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting, so the feds drove out to the booth and looked around. He begged them not to drive through, but they told him they already knew why they shouldn't, something we weren't expecting, so it's only a matter of time before they come for me. Even if our town prefers to keep things secret, I guess I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. The genie is out of the bottle. Although I can only speculate based on the posts I've put together, it appears that the clown is still on the loose with our hunter following closely behind. I can only hope that he catches it soon, but in the meantime, if you hear odd laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside that for a while. I thought I would at least let everyone know what's out there before the feds.